Alrighty, let's get the ball rolling here. We're now on the Roaring Twenties, so we're at the culture portion of the post-war era, the culture of the 1920s. If you're a fan of The Great Gatsby, this is your topic. A lot's going on in this topic. We're going to look at how increased leisure time and technological innovations led to widespread shared popular culture in the 1920s. We're going to look at the changing role of women, and we're going to look at something called modernism and how that impacted the 1920s as well. We're kind of building off of the previous one. So last time we talked about the economy. This time we're talking about the culture. So as prosperity increases, Americans and their leisure time reflect these changes. Now we've got a few new key terms. Do recall if you go onto Quizlet, I'll post the link in the description below, but I just have a bulk list for all of the key terms. The new ones we're adding with culture are flapper, modernism, prohibition, the 18th Amendment, and speak easy. So without further ado, let's get rolling. So the first order of business is looking at popular culture. We've already talked about how the automobile changes things, becoming more accessible. Now we're going to look at some of the effects. Essentially, now that Americans are able to afford cars, they have the time to use the cars, living for the weekend, they're going to use them. Increased monies mean that people are spending more money. And so we've got Americans listening to the radio, they're going to movies, they're listening to sports. Some people who live in big towns even get to go watch those sports. And what we see is something called a mass culture. Now, I'm going to be brutally honest. Mass culture is just pop culture. It's just an old-timey description for it. Essentially, mass culture or pop culture, I'll use them interchangeably. Mass culture is the idea of shared experiences. In previous eras, culture was much more localized. You might go to the same dance hall as the people around you. You might listen to the same music played by the same musicians, but it's different. If you go to the next town over, or you go to a different part of the country or a different part of the world, they don't have the same cultural experiences, even the same music. Like even if you take the same song, how it's played by one musician versus another musician is going to differ. And so before the 1920s, mass culture really isn't as big of a thing because Americans, or anyone for that matter, really can't share the exact same experiences. But with things like the record player, with the motion picture industry, movies, radio, Americans can now share a collective experience. You can be living in Nashville, you can live in New York, you can live in different parts of the country and hear the exact same music, whether it's through the record players or really powerful radio. And now those experiences that normally would be isolated to a region are shared across time and space, especially with records. You can pick up a record from the 1920s and listen to it today if it's in good enough condition. And so all we're seeing right here is people are sharing experiences. And all pop culture really is shared experiences. So the next time you're talking about your favorite TV show or you're talking about a song you listen to, that's what pop culture is talking about shared experiences, sharing experiences as well. Because that's what culture is in a lot of ways. It's doing something or experiencing something and then sharing it with others. That's what mass culture is, or pop culture, whatever you want to call it. Anyways, we're going to see more leisure time, so the Sunday drive, going out on the weekend, is going to be a popular activity. A caveat. A lot of the stuff I'm talking about applies heavily to the middle class and the more prosperous portions of the working class. Not everybody is living the high life, but more people are living it, or at least aspiring to it, than in any previous era. Let's take a look at the charts, because chart reading is important. But you can see right here that mass culture is going to expand as all of these go up. Radio sets become more and more common. People are going to the movies. I mean, look at this. 1930, Even during the Great Depression, which we'll talk about in the next unit, 73% of Americans are going to the movies on a weekly basis. People are able to talk about movies, share those experiences, and see the same things. We're seeing that as Americans are paid more money, they spend more money. So automobile spending, electricity, music, TV, and radio. As Americans spend more money, these things become more and more common. Thanks to the consumer revolution based in electricity, electricity is expanding, mostly in urban areas. Keep that in mind. But by the 20s, 50% of households have some electricity. By the 30s, they got 50 have an electric stove, 50%. By the 40s, we got a fridge and a telephone in half of American households. Essentially, technology is coming into people's lives, and it's impacting our culture. Of course, The Great Gatsby comes out. But this is going to be a grand time for Hollywood. It's considered the golden age of sports because some of the new forms of entertainment are movies. Some of the new forms of entertainment are sports and listening to the radio, especially at first. And so we now have this interconnected world, at least through entertainment. There's a few other things. The transatlantic flight, our textbook makes a big deal out of it. To be brutally honest, aircraft is more of a novelty until you get after World War II. Aircraft technology is improving dramatically. I mean, we go from kites with engines strapped on them to steel behemoths capable of carrying hundreds and hundreds of pounds. Hundreds of pounds of things. So, I mean, aircraft is is worth mentioning. The transatlantic flight caught a lot of attention, but really we're going to focus more on sports and different experiences. Babe Ruth is a fun example. I've talked about Hollywood. But the other thing we see is women's place in society is really going through a lot of changes. So the big changes we're seeing is that women are coming out into the public in greater and greater numbers. They're challenging the kind of sexist limitations in politics, economics, society, and education in this time period. Essentially, women are proving that there isn't just the place in the home. There's a place out in the workforce. There's a place out in society. The big game changer that we can obviously mark as a big change is the 19th Amendment. Women are given the right to vote. Now, officially, the reason given is because women did a patriotic service, serving as nurses, entering the workforce, and pulling their weight and the weight of others to help win the Great War. But really, they get the right to vote through concentrated campaigning. And the official reason is service in the Great War, that's what gets them the support they need to finally get the political freedom to participate via voting. But we're seeing a whole bunch of things. Some women use education as a way to get ahead. Some women use other things. A good example of education is as industrialization increases, as factories increase, there needs to be management of those factories. And so secretarial positions, office work becomes more commonplace, and many women find themselves with the skills or can work to get the skills to do that. Because offices need a lot of people, and women often will fill many of those roles. We often think of secretaries right off the bat as an example of that in this time period. We also have another group. This is probably one that students I've dealt with at least have heard of, and that is someone called the flapper. Now, there's a video that we have on flappers and what they do, but essentially flappers are it's a very individualistic and rebellious, some throw around the word modern, type of woman. Essentially, the flapper is a fiercely independent woman. She sees herself as equal to men, or at least unique, and deserves the same political and social rights as anyone else. They often dress in a certain way. They have often an androgynous look to them, short skirts. Many flappers like to party. See Great Gatsby. And it's a very rebellious, anti-Victorian, anti-traditional female role look. Part of the reason why the flappers are able to succeed is, well, it's a kind of a boring topic, but it's economics. As women enter the workforce in great numbers, they were pushed out briefly after World War I, but they're coming back in. Many women have more economic freedom than in previous eras, at least in Western society. Essentially, one of the problems that women would encounter in previous eras is that marriage was not just a building a family thing. It was also a matter of economic support. That was why many people married, is they needed the economic support to make a go of things. However, with jobs, even though women were often paid less, it gave them just enough financial independence that they could challenge societal norms, put off marriage, things like that. If you want to see political freedom and economic freedom bring about change, you gotta have the economics issue taken care of. So flappers are kind of this ideal rebellious women, not necessarily education focused. Flappers are the life of the party. This is further helped out by Hollywood starlets. Flappers are embodied in Hollywood movies, things like that. Here's a list of some of the firsts for women as they gain political and economic rights and freedoms. They, well, use them. When you give people a freedom, they take it. Now, I know I've been talking a lot about flappers and their rebelliousness. There actually weren't that many flappers in this time period, if we're being completely honest. The tricky part about being a flapper is you work hard, you party hard, and that is a brutal lifestyle. It's hard to maintain, and it only really happens in the biggest of cities. Hollywood starlets are probably the only true flappers for the most part, because they can afford that lifestyle. That doesn't mean that women didn't take up aspects of flappers. They might take the hairstyle. They might go out and party sometimes. They might have the economic independence. But flappers are an ideal, and not everyone embodies that. Also, another detail that's worth noting is even if a lot of people didn't want to be flappers, home life is still changing. Remember that consumer revolution? Almost all those consumer products are home products. Vacuum cleaners, washing machines, irons. Essentially, housework becomes easier in this time period. In the olden days, if you were rich enough, you'd hire servants. In this time period, more people can afford a vacuum cleaner. And so maintaining a home used to be, for many women, a full-time job. And with these technologies, they're much more able to complete this task. So even if not all women are going out into the workforce or rebelling as flappers, the ones who are at home are still seeing changes because their jobs, their tasks are much more efficient with the new tools that are available to them. And so we don't see armies and armies and armies of flappers. We see a lot of women take advantage of the ability to vote, the ability to have financial independence, the free time associated with not having to scrub clothes. You could just throw them in a clothing washer. So we're seeing a lot of changes. I do recommend watching this video if you're one of those more visual learners. It's literally just, this is what flappers look like. Alrighty, so this last part, we kind of shorten it a bit. So if you want to look at literature in more detail, I do recommend our textbook because we just don't have time in U.S. History 2 to cover things in as deep a detail. I'm going to give you some overarching themes. And the big thing that you need to take away from this is the Great War altered a lot of things. We get some new ideas like jazz, which is where you take African American music, European music, and some instruments, mash them together, and that's what jazz is. That's a new idea coming out of this time period, to be very specific. But what our textbook and what a lot of people focus on is something called modernism. Essentially, the Great War, the people returning from the Great War saw the world differently in ways that did not really seem prevalent in previous eras, and they applied that to their arts. Some of the common themes in modernism of the 1920s is uncertainty, and new ideas being tried and applied, new topics to create art about. There's this thing called modernism, which is in the room. I suppose it's worth me taking a moment to define modernism. I'm going to be upfront and honest with you. Modernism is a really annoying term. It's been a term that's been thrown around since the 1700s, and if you study modernism in any amount, you'll discover that it often sounds very similar, even though everyone says it's a new idea, it's a new idea. Well, there was a modernist movement before World War I. There was a modernist movement after World War I. There was a modernist movement after World War II. What is modernism? Well, there's many different definitions, but there's a very simple one that I'm going to give you. And the simple definition of modernism is to break from the past. It doesn't matter if it's movies, if it's art, if it's any other medium of culture. That's what modernism is. It's breaking from the past. You might be asking, what is the past? Well, that's up to definition. For modern art, if you were a traditional artist, you might study the classics in Italy, Raphael, Donatello, and the other Ninja Turtles. But you would study these classical works and you'd copy them, and then you would build your art style off of those copies. In modernism, you would do something different. Instead of looking to the past for new ideas, you would say, how do my experiences amount for something? Do something different. Modernism in art, once again, I did a lot of modern art when I was in college, studied a lot of art in college, but modern art might be rebellious in the sense that traditional art might paint landscapes or portrait pictures, formal pictures, whereas modern art might be depicting a worker at work, or it might, instead of trying to get a photorealistic look, they'd have a more abstract look. Modernism takes many forms, but the core idea of all modernism is to break from the past. To break from the past. That's what modernism is. And whatever time period or movement you study gives you the definition of the past and what they're trying to break from. Anyways, here's a modernist painting that kind of reflects some of the uncertainty of the era. You've got, we analyzed it in more detail in class, but I'll give you a quick rundown. But here you see this flapper girl. It's late at night. Maybe she just left a party because you can see her makeup smudged. She kind of has a blank, tired stare, perhaps looking into her coffee cup. And she's looking at it and perhaps thinking, where am I going with my life? Unlike tradition, where tradition has a fairly predictable route, the modernist era is something new, breaking from the past. But where does it go from there? Modernism doesn't always promise that. And so a lot of modernism kind of depicts this uncertainty of the new era. We're going into a new world, but what does that mean? The other thing that it kind of has alluded to with war altered the way writers and artists viewed the world. One of the other things we see, perhaps one of the most significant changes, is how people view war. Some people don't view war as this glorious thing anymore. Some people began viewing war as this nightmarish thing. A good example of this is depictions of hell change after the Great War. Before the Great War, most depictions of hell, if you're thinking the medieval ages, you've got demons running around and whatnot. Medieval art is weird, admittedly. But you've got kind of almost like Dante's Inferno, Greek mythology kind of depiction of suffering and whatnot, Christianity model as well. After World War I, some people depict hell as no man's land. And I wish I could remember who said the quote, but as one person put it, The difference between hell and no man's land is at least the people in hell deserve to be there. And so that's another aspect of modernism, is this breaking down of traditional good and evil. Sometimes there's this kind of destructive indifference and nightmarish thing. I feel like I'm slipping into Lovecraft references. He was pre-World War I, though, I think. Yeah. Anyways, but it shows nothing new under the sun. We don't spend as much time on the different works of literature because we figure English classes can handle whatever they deem necessary. But The Great Gatsby is a good example of some things. I know a lot of classes read Farewell to Arms. And those are the two books I've actually read. I'm not as well read on the American classics as I would appear. I use TV tropes to cover a lot of ground. Anyways, the last thing I want to cover, and we're actually going to roll into it in classroom activities, is something called Prohibition. Also what comes up is the ban of alcohol sales during the 1920s, and it's created with the 18th Amendment. I think I'm going to leave that to a different aspect, but this is another aspect of culture that is going on, and we will talk about it in class, and we'll do some activities. If you're interested, I do have some stuff on here on it, and world history and European history can't escape me, it seems, and there's a history of Russia and vodka in here as well. So we're going to work on Prohibition in class, but that is another aspect of culture in the 1920s. I'm going to wrap it up here, and with all that being said, thanks for watching, and I hope this lecture slides help you. And until later.